By late 1944, the war in Europe had entered its most dangerous phase. The Allies were advancing fast, but so were the rumors. Inside Allied headquarters, reports kept arriving. Intercepted messages, prisoner interrogations, whispered intelligence from the front lines. Again and again, one name surfaced in German conversations: Patton, General George S. Patton. German officers didn't just respect him, they feared him. Some enemy generals reportedly believed Patton commanded far more troops than he actually did. Others were convinced that wherever he appeared, disaster followed. Fast, brutal, unstoppable. One captured officer allegedly said, "If Patton is nearby, the attack has already begun. We just don't know it yet." These reports landed on the desk of Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower. At first, Eisenhower remained skeptical. He had worked with Patton long enough to know two things. Patton was brilliant on the battlefield. Patton was also unpredictable, loud, and dangerously aggressive. But this was different. German generals weren't just reacting to Patton's actions, they were reacting to the idea of him. Entire defensive plans were being shifted. Units were redeployed. Supplies were held back, just in case Patton was coming. One intelligence officer summed it up quietly. "Sir, the Germans are planning around Patton more than around our actual movements." Eisenhower leaned back in his chair. If the enemy feared one man this much, then that fear itself could become a weapon. And that was when Eisenhower said something that stunned the room, something that would later be repeated in Allied circles as both a compliment and a warning. "Even the Germans know," but he didn't finish the sentence. Not yet. Eisenhower didn't speak right away. The room was quiet. Too quiet for a war headquarters. Maps lay open, radios hummed softly, and every officer waited for a reaction. Finally, Dwight D. Eisenhower looked up from the intelligence report. "The Germans aren't afraid of our numbers," he said calmly. "They're afraid of who they think is coming." He tapped the paper once. "They don't panic when they hear Montgomery," Eisenhower continued. "They calculate. They prepare." Then he paused. "But when they hear Patton, they move." Several officers exchanged glances. German plans showed it clearly now. Defensive lines were being reinforced in the wrong sectors. Armored divisions were being repositioned days too early. Supply convoys were stalled, not because of Allied pressure, but because commanders feared Patton might strike at any moment. One intelligence officer added quietly, "Sir, some enemy generals believe Patton never announces his attacks. They think if he's silent, that's the most dangerous moment." Eisenhower leaned forward. That was the moment it clicked. Patton didn't need to be everywhere. He didn't even need to be present. The enemy was already fighting him in their heads. Eisenhower finally finished the sentence he had started earlier. "Even the Germans know. Patton isn't just a general. He's a force." He looked around the room. And forces can be redirected. What Eisenhower realized that night would shape the next phase of the war, not through louder guns or bigger armies, but through controlled fear. And quietly, without Patton even knowing it yet, Eisenhower decided to let the enemy keep believing their worst nightmare was on the move, whether it was true or not. The decision Eisenhower made didn't involve new divisions or louder offensives. It involved silence. Instead of rushing George S. Patton toward the front, Eisenhower ordered something far more subtle. Patton's headquarters stayed active. Radios transmitted routine chatter, vehicles moved at night, inflatable tanks were quietly positioned where enemy reconnaissance could spot them. On paper, it looked like preparation for a massive strike. To the Germans, it looked like a nightmare returning. Enemy intelligence reports began stacking up fast. Scouts reported armor where none existed. Intercepts suggested Patton was waiting. German generals argued over maps late into the night, trying to guess where the blow would fall. One German officer later admitted, "We feared Patton more when he was quiet than when he was attacking." Entire divisions were held back to face him. Fuel was rationed. Reserves stayed frozen in place. and while the enemy waited for Patton. The real Allied movement happened somewhere else. When the actual attack came, it didn't come from the direction the Germans feared most. Their strongest units were watching shadows, while the real Allied forces advanced against weakened defenses. Only later did the truth become clear. Patton had never been there. He had never needed to be. Eisenhower had turned a man's reputation into a weapon, one that confused the enemy, slowed their response, and bought precious time. By the time German commanders realized they had been outmaneuvered, it was already too late. They hadn't lost to Patton's tanks. They had lost to the idea of Patton, and Eisenhower knew it. Weeks later, the battlefield told a strange story. German positions had collapsed faster than expected, but not because they were outnumbered. Many of their strongest units were simply not where they were needed most. Captured officers began to talk. Interrogations revealed the same pattern again and again. German commanders had delayed counterattacks. They had waited for confirmation. They had held reserves back, convinced that George S. Patton was about to strike from another direction. One senior officer admitted quietly, "If we moved too early, we feared we would expose ourselves to Patton." The irony was brutal. By fearing Patton's arrival, they had guaranteed their own defeat elsewhere. When these reports reached Dwight D. Eisenhower, he didn't celebrate. He simply nodded. The strategy had worked, but it carried a dangerous risk. Patton himself had no idea how heavily his name was being used. Eisenhower knew that if Patton ever learned he was being turned into a phantom threat, the general's pride might explode the entire illusion. So Eisenhower kept him focused, kept him busy, kept him loud, while secretly benefiting most from his silence. Behind closed doors, Allied planners now spoke openly about it. They weren't just fighting enemy armies anymore. They were fighting enemy expectations. And as long as the Germans believed Patton could appear anywhere at any moment, they would never fully commit their strength. But the illusion couldn't last forever. Sooner or later, the enemy would realize the truth, and when they did, even Eisenhower wasn't sure what Patton's reaction would be. After the war, the questions finally came. During debriefings and post-war interviews, former German generals were asked what had shaped their decisions in the final year of the conflict. Many expected answers about numbers, air power, or supply shortages. Instead, one name kept returning: George S. Patton. Several German officers admitted that entire strategies had been altered because of him, not because of what he was doing, but because of what they believed he might do. One former general said plainly, "We prepared for Patton even when there was no sign of him. Ignoring that possibility felt suicidal." When this reached Dwight D. Eisenhower, he allowed himself a rare, quiet smile. Years earlier, he had understood something the enemy never fully grasped. Fear doesn't need confirmation. It only needs credibility. Patton had that credibility in abundance. Eisenhower later explained it to a close aide. When the enemy plans around one man instead of the battlefield, you've already won half the fight. Patton, for his part, never truly realized how powerful his shadow had been. He believed victories came from speed, force, and aggression. Eisenhower knew better. Sometimes the most decisive weapon in war isn't a tank or an army. It's the certainty in your enemy's mind that you are coming. And that is why Eisenhower's words endured. Even the Germans knew Patton didn't just attack positions. He attacked confidence.